Okay, I got the top of the hour here. Should we kick in?
Say yes.
All right, we have a pretty full agenda. We only have an hour today. We have taken recently to only having 1 hour meetings. This is the Registration Protocols Extensions Working Group. I'm Jim Galvin here at the front of the room, and Antoine Bouchard is the big head in the corner. Your co-chairs for this group. So welcome everyone and those online. And I know that there are some people who are definitely at a very difficult hour for them. So appreciate you making time to join us and be here today. All right, so let's move on here. First up, of course, is our Note Well. Certainly, this is Thursday, and as been said many times, by the time we get around to Thursday, you've certainly seen this more than once. You've hopefully read it more than once. So please do pay attention. You know, it is important. We do have our own code of conduct, expected standards of behavior, and requirements about the work that we do here. And, you know, you should make sure to take a good look at this and make sure that you are aware of it and abiding by the principles. Next slide, of course, is just a summary of our code of conduct guidelines. Please, just a reminder, we are supposed to treat each other with respect here. Let's focus on the ideas and the work, not on each other. We work for best engineering judgment all around, looking for the best solution all around, and contributing, to our work in a positive way and to the IETF in a positive way, and certainly with each other. We are thankful to have the transcript, real-time scripting that's going on. So also a reminder to please speak slowly, and please do make a point of saying your name when you first come to the microphone to speak, so that can also be captured in the transcript. And of course, masks are required, except when you're actually speaking at the microphone, you are permitted to drop your mask. Usually it's helpful. There is a certain amount of muffling that goes on when you're wearing a mask at the microphone, but if you can speak loudly, you can get through all of that. Otherwise, please do make sure you have it on, and also keep it on. If you need to, you're allowed to slip it down to drink something. Okay, any agenda bashing? The agenda's been up for some time. Slide deck went up yesterday. If you downloaded the slide deck yesterday, a new version was uploaded today because one of the links in the slide deck was wrong. Thanks to Jim Gould for noticing that. Impressive that he caught that in looking through all the slides very carefully. But, there you go. So we uploaded some new slides late this morning, Yokohama time. So the slides are all the same except for the one link. So you don't urgently need a new slide deck now, but you may want to pick it up later. This is this outline here for the agenda is pro forma. This is what we've been using here for a couple of years now. So the only thing that really changes is the last couple of presentations at the bottom about potential new work. Okay, so moving into welcome and introductions. For a note scribe, Rick Wilhelm has agreed to make some careful bullet point notes in the notes file. But as you have learned this week, if you have been around at all, anyone can please contribute to the notes file. It's open as long as you're logged in. Please do go check it out. At a minimum, please, if you speak at the microphone, go back and check the notes and make sure that the point you were trying to make has been properly recorded. We really do need everyone here to help ourselves to get the right records going. We've seen the note well. Our document management is just about reminding people we are a small working group. We have a relatively small group of us who try to progress work and move it forward. We really are dependent on all of us always reading all documents, unfortunately, but we appreciate that folks do that. And in addition, document shepherds are important. Again, unfortunately, we have a limited set of people who do that. but document shepherds are really important to the work. The chairs depend on them too, to help us to evaluate comments during working group last call, making sure that all issues have been covered, as well as filling out the long 18-page questionnaire that the ISG requires when you're going to submit a document for publication. So document shepherds are an important part, and we're thankful for everyone who helps us to get that done. Okay. Published RFCs, well, none this time. We have a lot that are very close to being done. So I expect before this calendar year is out, we'll definitely see some publications this calendar year, but none since November and the last IETF. So moving into documents and working group last call, we have one at the moment, and that's the RDAP reverse search capabilities document. This has kind of been a little bit of a long time coming, but it's there. We extended that last call to be 3 weeks long because we opened it over the IETF meeting, so it doesn't end until after next week. A week from Monday is when that will end. Please do indicate your support or non-objection to the document. You know, we really do want to see some number of people, ideally at least 5, to say that they have no objection to a document. And that can be a bit of a challenge. You know, it is, again, we're just a small group of people. We really do depend on all of us to take a look at things and make sure that everything meets with, you know, good product for the internet at large. So thanks for that. I did want to take a moment to mention the internationalized email address document. There's been quite some discussion going on in the mailing list. It's not actually a working group document. It's just important to call that out. It's sitting in the ISG queue. It has been sitting there for some time. We had some issues that came up during IETF last call. There's been quite a lot of discussion going on the mailing list about all of those. Our area director is actually waiting for Antoine and I as co-chairs to send a note to say what the status of the document is. Version 18 was just recently published on this. So all of the discussion that has happened within this working group on the mailing list, in principle, the assertion with that version 18 is that it addresses all of that open discussion and comes to a conclusion. Honestly, we just have to confirm that. So the chairs just own that responsibility at the moment. We have to catch up on all of that, make sure that the changes really match everything. And then our area director will be able to release the document, and it'll then move on and be published. So that's where it's sitting, and wanted to call it out so that folks knew where that was. Okay. Before we get into a status of existing work, I just thought I would take a moment and see if anyone has any questions or comments about anything up to this point. Not seeing anyone jump up out of their chair, nor putting their hand up. So let's move into status of existing work. This is also going to be a short thing here. We have, everybody has 60 seconds or less to say something. Does anybody want to say anything about the redacted fields in RDAP and its status? I don't think Jim Gold is with us. Jody, I know that you're out there. Oh, Jim is with us. Please, Jim, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. Yeah, we feel like this document is complete and ready to go, and requested formally on the list for working group last call. So that's pretty much it.
No, thanks, Jim. And that's a heads up to everyone here. You can look for that. One of the other things is, given that we are a small group, we do tend to do one working group last call at a time, so that we're not burdening people with too much to do all at once. Again, just being sensitive to the size of our group and the people doing things forward. So thanks for that, Jim. Antoine, please go ahead.
Yeah, well, when we know this is going into working group last call within, I think, a week, something like that, 1 or 2 weeks, If people still have issues with this document, it's advised, of course, to give those remarks now so that we will have a stable document during working group last call. So it's just a heads up for people, review the draft now, and we will have less work during working group last call and have support.
Yes, excellent advice. Feel free to read now. Don't wait for the working group last call. Murray, please go ahead.
Hi. When do you think this WGLC might happen?
As soon as we get out of the RDAP reverse search, so which ends a week from Monday, and as long as nothing happens there, then we'll issue this working group last call after that.
So, okay, so that one's in. Oh, you're going to issue that one. I'm trying to figure out where I'm going to be during the parts of April where you're going to need me to move things along. So that one's going to come before about the 17th. Okay, the first one's good. Thanks.
No problem. For the simple registration reporting, I take ownership of that. Folks who have been paying attention will know that that has actually expired. Part of that, though, I'll speak a little bit for the registration data dictionary. Since that one got pulled back, the registration data dictionary, you'll recall it was in working group last call. It was decided to pull it back to do some work on it. And what we're going to do is coordinate our efforts there. The registration reporting has two major parts. One is, in fact, actually a data dictionary itself, as well as the second thing, which is creating two sets of registries at IANA. What I want to do in the registration reporting document is pull the data dictionary part out and instead, let it be part of the registration data dictionary document. And so leverage that instead so that we don't have two of those. That seems like the right thing to do at this point. So that will come along eventually here, but nothing urgent. We have a number of other documents in front of that. Federated authentication for RDAP and OpenID. Scott, would you like to say anything about that? Please go ahead.
Thank you, Jim. Scott Hollenbeck here. We went through a working group last call a few months ago, got some very good feedback that caused us to pause and not progress the document at that time. But all of that feedback has been resolved and addressed, and I feel that this document too is ready to go through another working group last call.
Okay, thank you, Scott. And that's a heads up to folks. Please, you don't have to wait for working group last call to give it a final read. Do that now and get in front of it so you can vote quickly when the working group last call comes around. As Antoine said, better to get the comments in now than during working group last call, if we can. Registration data dictionary is the last there. I know that Heather and Steve aren't with us. Stefan, you're out there. Would you like to say anything about this document, or is what I said enough? As the document shepherd, go ahead.
Stefan Bartmeyer. No, not really anything to say. There have been few discussions in the document, and mostly my feeling is that the comments have been addressed, but I didn't notice a lot of opinions, input about the document. So if the group has something to say, do it.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that. Okay, and with that, we will move into existing work discussions. We have some presentations, and I'm going to turn this over to Antoine to run us through the rest of the meeting. Antoine, over to you.
Yes, so a bit confusing. Jim, are you going to put up the slides or?
If you would like, I can do that.
Yeah, okay, so go to the next one, right? So we have a few presentations. First one is from Tom Harrison, who is remote. So if you can put up Tom's slides, then we will hand it over to Tom. Tom, are you ready?
Go ahead, Tom. If you're speaking, we can't hear you.
Okay, you can hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. Okay, thanks. Next slide. So to recap briefly, this is a document that defines new search and search-related functionality for IP ranges, ASNs, and domains. The first part is search by handle and name for IP and ASN objects. The second part is a new link relation for getting the more specific objects for an IP range or an ASN range or a reverse domain. And the last part is adapting the reverse search document so that it can be used to support IP addresses and ASNs. The idea here is that an RDAP service operator who implements this functionality will get to parity with the existing WHOIS service, or at least that's the case for all the RIR services today. And that will help with transitioning clients off WHOIS onto RDAP and potentially with deprecation of the WHOIS service in future. Next slide. Since this was last covered at IETF115, there have been a few changes. The first is the previous version of the document was in terms of RIRs, but RIRs aren't the only service operators who have internet number resource RDAP services. So instead, it's now in terms of INR registries to cover cases like national registries. One issue is, though, that we still need to change the document title to account for that, to make it consistent all the way throughout. Another set of changes is that the document's been updated to match the latest reverse search document. So the main change out of that is a bunch of extra IANA registry entries for the various IP and ASN reverse searches. And the last part is marking this document as updating the HTTP usage and query and response JSON documents, because the way it uses the extension identifier is not in keeping with the requirements from those documents. And that seems like a reasonable way to flag to people that it's not doing what those documents require in this space. Next slide. We did get some feedback on the last version of the document from Mario. Thanks, Mario. There are a number of text and editorial updates. Most of those are unproblematic. There are a couple we have some concerns about, but they should be really straightforward to fix, so we'll just take those to the list. There was a comment to have the document be in terms of RIR instead of INR registry, but per the last slide, the idea here is to make this more generic to cover more use cases, basically. So it should be that if we update the document title, that gets rid of the inconsistency, which may be causing some confusion here, and hopefully that will address this problem. The last part is the way that the document works with the more specific responses is it leaves it up to the server to implement however it likes. So it doesn't make any statements about what the links should look like or anything like that. The problem is that that means that RDAP servers will essentially end up squatting on part of the URL space. So not that this is complicated to fix, we just need to reserve a path segment under which server operators can put those more specific links. So that should look after that part. Next slide.
Tom, you have a question in the queue. Do you want to take it now or wait to the end?
Oh, yeah, sure. Yep.
Yeah, I was waiting for that too. So Scott has a question. Scott, go ahead.
Thank you, Anton. Thank you, Jim. This is Scott Hollenbeck. Tom, back on slide 3, I noticed that you're recommending an update to several full standard RFCs because this document is doing something that you described as non-standard. Could you, I apologize, I have not read the draft in detail. Of course, what it means I do have an opinion, right? But no, in all seriousness, could you please talk about that a little bit more? What is it doing and why is it doing it that way?
Sure. The main thing is that with a strict reading of those documents, you would need to, like all new path segments would need to begin with the extension identifier. And the extension identifier here, I think, is RIR search or something like that. And it will be updated to be something like INR registry search. But what we want to avoid here is having URLs like INR registry search _IP for searching IP, for doing the IP searches rather, and similarly for doing the ASN searches. So the idea is to make them consistent with the other core RDAP object types as far as these searches go. The URLs will simply be slash, I forget what the exact segment will look like, but something like probably slash IPs actually. And even though this isn't in keeping with the strict reading of those documents, it's more consistent with how those base specifications are put together. So that's the rationale. I'm not sure if updating those documents is the best way of indicating non-conformance with that, or if there's some other way to do it. It seemed like a reasonable stab at the problem, though.
Question or perhaps a remark from Andy? Andy, go ahead.
Andy Newton. So when we originally created this, and I don't know if this is said anywhere, but when you do an extension that's an IETF extension, that whole thing about putting a prefix in there isn't really necessary. And that's because the IETF knows how to avoid collisions where people just doing extensions in the wild don't. So that I don't think for that reason you need to update this document, these documents. There is one slight other thing though. I believe 9083 or 9082, I can't remember which one, actually says RIR, not INR. So there's that. I don't know if you need to update those documents, but maybe there should be some sort of statement somewhere that says, by the way, these things can work for INRs as well. There's no reason why 9082 and 9083 don't work for INRs, but that was just the terminology we used.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, Murray, go ahead.
Yeah, on the question of whether you should do an updates or not, we interpret, update 7480 to mean someone implementing 7480 had better come and read this document as well, because it's some kind of important extension like that. If you don't mean that, then updates is the wrong mechanism to use. But I hear what you're trying to do, and I'm happy to work with you to find some way to create the pointer you're talking about without, if you do it as updates, then by the time it gets to us, someone like, well, it's not actually updating the original one in that way. So I can help you figure something out.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, so just as far as next steps go, we've reached out to the various sub-regional registries looking for input from them. We haven't heard anything from them yet, though. And yeah, more implementation work would be helpful. Thank you.
Okay, any questions for Tom? If not, then I have a question. Tom, I've been reading this draft, and one of my particular interests was in the link relations sections. First, a comment. To me, it was unclear what you meant with operator. I first thought that what would be the client. I think in terminology, it would be the server operator, who determines, what hierarchy you can request. But I have a question about this hierarchy, because when I query an RER database or an NIR database, whatever you call it, when I do a query, I don't know where in the hierarchy I am. So in order to get, for example, what I'm mostly interested in is the top of the hierarchy, which is usually the allocation and the one responsible, for example, for creating ROAS. And sometimes I'm interested in the assignment of IP space. So that's mostly the bottom, which are assignments. So I was wondering, have you thought about another query where I could immediately get to the top or the bottom of the hierarchy?
I hadn't thought about that, but we can add that in fairly. Yeah, I think that makes sense to add in.
Yeah,
there are
relative to the registry, right? Because I see you didn't get input yet from other registries. I use RIPE a lot, and they also include, for example, the IANA allocations in their database. So you don't want to go as far as that, but
No,
you would be interested in, the RAR allocations, because that gives an impression of who is responsible for this address space. And the lowest one would probably be the assignment, so you can actually look at who is using this address space. So those are the two queries that it's in the document already, but in order to get that, you would have to do reiterative searches to get to the top or to the bottom.
Yeah, sure. Yep. I don't see any issue with adding those. That sounds fun.
Okay, I'll post a message to the list then to make that. A second question I have is, so this is for at the moment querying for OutNum objects and INetNum objects, or IP objects depending on the registry. But IP space and ASN space, right?
There are also some things. I think more specifics is applied to domain objects as well.
Okay, so domain object is in there. Well, I was wondering if you considered it to be extended also to RAR routing registry objects, since they are sometimes in RAR databases as well. For example, in RIPE, when I query address space, I get route objects back as well. Or do you consider that to be a separate document?
I think that would be a separate document. There was a document. I think it'd be about 10 years ago now. I think that some people did. I think maybe Andy was involved in that for bringing those IRR objects into RDAP. So I think if that happened, that would be a separate document. It's not one of our immediate goals in this space.
Yeah, because when you're talking about ASN, so OutNum objects, there's already some routing information in there. So import export statements. So I was wondering, if you put this in a separate document, you will have two documents where one of it is halfly covering the Internet Routing Registry space, and the other document the specific routing registry space.
Yeah, that's true. It's definitely something we can think about.
Something to consider, perhaps.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, that was me. Then Jasdip, go ahead.
Hi, Jasdeep Singh from Erin. So yeah, Antoine, that's a very good point you made about IRR objects. But I think our focus here is to bring RDAP at parity with whois, non-IRR whois, if that makes sense. Because as Tom mentioned, I think in the first slide, the goal is to at some point think of it as a true replacement for port 43 services, what we have. So yeah, so if IRR we need to do those use cases, probably we could think sort of in a separate document or a separate set of use cases. So, but we truly wanted to keep the focus on, hey, what are the gaps vis-a-vis the current whois service, which for RARs is right now 90% for traffic. So thanks.
Thank you. So if there are no more questions, then thank you, Tom. And Jim, if you can put up the slides again. I think the next one is going to be Mario, indeed, with the JSON contact document. So Mario, go ahead, please.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. Yes, I requested this slot of time just to invite working group members to resume the discussion now and then and later on the mailing list about two open topics of this document, which we haven't still reached the consensus on. So next slide, please. The first topic is about how to redact just contact UID property in RDAP. Just a brief recall of the discussion. Following the discussion on the list about the implication between the JS contact document and redacted document, James asked me and the other co-author, Robert Stefanek, to consider the removal of the mandatory constraint on the UID property in view of its usage and reduction in JS contact of JS contact in RDAP. So I put the question to the collect members, and they decided to keep the UID property mandatory because, in their opinion, a unique identifier is needed, like similarly to the formatted name property for vCard. But nevertheless, in their opinion, UID can be omitted outside the collect context. So JS contact UID remains a mandatory property. Its value should be a URN, but for compatibility with 6350, it may also be a URI or a free text value. In the case where you use the URN format, this should be a URN in the UUID namespace. Next slide, please. So, in my opinion, the possible option to redact the JS contact UID in RDAP are the following. So, redacting by an empty value method in the same way as the format name property for vCard, making UID optional in RDAP, so overriding the mandatory constraint of the JS contact spec, and then redacting by removal method, or using ID values that prevent from correlation, randomly generated or nil UUIDs, or anything else that I miss. This is the first point. The other point, next slide, please, is about JCard to JS contact transition. So Andy has proposed to treat JS contact like any other extension. This means the clients use just the JS card parameter to receive JS contact, and server return both JCard and JS content until transition is ended. Compared to the current approach, this means that obviously there is a lower implementation effort for both clients and servers, but I think that there are some drawbacks. The contact data are duplicated, therefore search responses could be remarkably much bigger than it could be by using only JS contact or vCard. There are some implications on reverse search mapping and response redacting, because obviously in the case of reduction you have to duplicate all the properties that have been redacted, and there are some implications on the mapping between on the reverse search property of the reverse search properties. And last but not least, the responses can be broken since the servers decide on their own when to stop returning JCard. So these are the 2 points that we need to discuss to reach the consensus, because I would like to have instruction from the working group members before publishing the new version of this document. So I don't know if we want to resume the discussion here on this on one of these points, and then and later on the mailing list.
Okay, I already see people joining the queue. Do you have more slides, Mario?
No.
Okay, so this at the end. We have 3 minutes left for question then. So Andy, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm a little confused by the bullet point that says lower implementation effort for both clients and servers. Which approach is that discussing? The approach that's currently in the draft, or some other approach?
No, there is one approach. The current approach is to return or JS contact or vcard. Your proposal is to return both. So the JS contact is treated as an extension, so merely as a response extension. So I think that obviously the main reason why to choose to opt for your approach is the lower implementation effort. Obviously it's easier than the current approach, the current proposal. But I see those drawbacks in your approach. So I'm open to every approach. So, but I would like to know what kind of approaches the working group prefer the most. So just to move forward the document. So
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I would like to hear what other people think.
so
The point. Go ahead, Mario.
Yeah, I objectively provide the pros and cons of each approach. So, in my opinion, the best is the current approach, but I am open to any other proposal to improve the document, obviously. So.
Okay, so the point I was trying to make on the mailing list, and maybe it didn't come across very well, was that that a client is, once you've gone through, a client has gone through the implementation work of understanding JS contact, they're almost always going to send both parameters saying, I want both. And then they'll just deal with it when they get the response. So this really, I don't think those query parameters actually help at all. That's the point I was trying to say, because once a client implements that, they're always just going to ask for both, because they have no idea ahead of time whether the server supports both or not. And since there's not going to be a flag day on the internet for supporting JS contact, and maybe we want to do that, I don't know, but that's the option they're going to have to go with. Does that make sense? And for a transition period, you're going to have servers doing both anyway, if there is a transition period.
Yeah, but I don't think that the clients will receive an error. They receive a response. Probably they will not receive the data in the format they expect. But simply when you specify a parameter that is not supported, that parameter is ignored by the server. So there is always a case, the possibility that you specify a parameter. For example, you specify the JS card parameter, but you don't need to specify that because the transition has been completed. So and at the beginning, you know that the service is able to support the JS contact because it is exposed in the ADAP conformance array. So I think that the two approaches are close, but maybe I can see that I can say that the second approach is to consist in applying the first approach, your approach, twice, because you had to, as I told you in a mail on the mailing list. You need to support one parameter for a period, and then to ignore that parameter. And in your approach, this happened once. In the current approach, this happens twice, because at the first you need to support JS card, and then you need to support JCard to
Mario, yeah, we are running
Mario.
a little bit.
Okay.
So perhaps we can continue this discussion on the mailing list.
Okay.
We have 2 questions left, and we're already 2 minutes over time. So, Jim, perhaps you can post your questions, and then Mario can answer at once. So, James, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll be very quick. On the question around UID, my preference would be redaction by removal, and I'm really glad to hear that UID will not be mandatory to be able to support downstream protocols like RDAP. Thank you.
I've not seen it on the app.
That was Mark. So then, Jim, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Mark Antoine. I've not really got a question, but it's more of an observation. If we're going to look at I like Andy's suggestion, but I think it'd be a good idea to try and get some objective data about where these problems that Mario has identified are actually valid or not. So do we really have to worry about the cost of increased data? Are there going to be implications on reverse data? Let's try and get some data on that rather than just working hunches.
Okay, thank you, Jim. Mario, if you don't have any urgent responses, then let's discuss this.
I would like to say that to facilitate the discussion again on the mailing list, I will post again the 2 topics separately, so we can move on new posts.
Yeah.
We're going to discuss on new posts.
So thank you, Mario. So we will continue that on the mailing list. Due to time, we have to continue because we have 2 presentations left, and I want to give them the same attention as you, Mario. So thank you very much for your presentation. That was the existing work, and we have 2 presentations on new work. First one is versioning in RDAP by Daniel Keatley, and I see Dan already ready. So Jim, if you can bring up Dan's presentation, then Daniel, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Daniel Keathley. And go ahead. Yeah, we're going to talk about RDAP versioning. You can go to the next slide, please. Okay, prior to today, IETF114, if I'm not mistaken, we discussed the original extension mechanism for RDAP, and we agreed on 2 things at that time. First, that the extension mechanism would not formally support any type of versioning. And second, that versioning is important and should be supported somehow. And so we have the versioning extension that came out of that initial discussion, which we'll discuss further today. Next chart, please. So it is a extension that will be used to version other extensions. It will provide a modified form of semantic versioning, which is already widely used in industry, typically consisting of a 3-point versioning scheme. We need only concern ourselves with 2 points, major and the minor. Major being used to signal breaking changes to a extension from one iteration to the next, changes that would break backwards compatibility. and minor version used to signal non-breaking changes to a spec for an extension. And for the example there, 1.0, if the next iteration included breaking changes, you would expect to see it released as a 2.0. Otherwise, it would be released as a 1.1. The objectives of this on the server side, the server can potentially support one or more versions of any given extension at the same time. Clients can discover which versions of an extension the server is using and supports, and they can use either the default version that the server uses by default, or they can specify a version that they would like the server to use via a query parameter. Next chart. It also includes, in addition to the RDAP help response, by adding a new member called versioning help. And this is simply present to list all of the extensions that a server supports, the full domain over all types of queries, and all of the versions of each of those extensions that the server supports. It can also include some additional metadata, like whether or not a version is to be used by default by the server, any documentation, and also temporal information that can be used to negotiate upgrade timeframes from one version of an extension to another. Next. This is just an example. Again, this versioning extension is an extension itself, so you'll expect to see that in each of these responses. And here you can see a server advertising, signaling that it supports two different versions of the versioning extension. I say those words a lot. With a default version, which will be used if no specific parameter is supplied by the client. Next chart, please. So that was the help response. And in addition to that, we'll look at just functional query responses. And those will receive an additional member as well, a versioning member, which lists any extensions that are being used in that particular response. In addition to the RDAP conformance member, which simply lists the extensions that are being used, this provides further information as to which version of those extensions is being used. I meant to say earlier, one of the problems this is trying to address is with RDAP conformance block only, as these extensions evolve and change, the ability for a client to sufficiently determine how the data is going to be bundled becomes ambiguous by just the RDAP conformance block. And so this versioning scheme allows for a tighter and more clear understanding for how the data is going to be packaged. So this versioning block would be included in query responses to provide which version of the extensions is being used so that the client can understand how to process the data in the response. Next chart. And this is just an example of a client specifying a version of an extension that it would like the server to use. It obviously needs to be one of the versions that the server supports as defined in the help response, but then this would lock the version of any given extension to something that is well known to the client. Next chart. So again, just to wrap it up, this is hopefully it's intended to help negotiate versions and understanding the data that's being passed between the client and server. It also helps upgrading and changes such that their clients aren't surprised if a server changes a version overnight and the data format changes. This should allow clients to keep responses in a format that they understand until such a time as they're ready to update to the next version of an extension. And finally, this is a draft that is already out there, and the purpose of this talk here today is to just generate interest and awareness and to hopefully get some discussion going on the mail list to pick it up and adopt it as a working group document. That's the last slide.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. We have 2 minutes or 1.5 minutes left for questions. Does anybody have a question for Daniel? Andy, please go ahead.
Is the idea that this is supposed to be mandatory for all future extensions?
Yes, I believe it is.
Okay, so what are we going to do about the current extensions? And to be honest, if it's mandatory, I think this is a really bad idea. Then just because we're going to have multiple issues with the current extensions that are already in there. The other thing is that the way this currently defines how you get a version information is you have to go look for this one string over here, then you have to dive over here and look at this other string. And by the way, that other string isn't structured, or it's structured, but you have to go parse the string, which is kind of odd. Since we have JSON, you could just actually break out all that information. I don't know. I think this is. I think parts of this draft are interesting for trying to do things that allow you to iterate fast on an extension, not ones that would actually be something that you'd have a standard on. But if it's mandatory for all future extensions, I see this as kind of complicating the protocol quite a bit.
Okay, thank you, Andy. Jim, you have the last 10 seconds. Go ahead, Jim.
I'm getting my audio going. Thank you. To respond to Andy, as far as dealing with existing extensions, we actually have a section in the draft to address how to address existing extensions. And this particular extension addresses something that we already have in EPP. So the ability to be able to negotiate the versioning, I believe, is very important. So I don't see it as adding complexity. I think it's addressing the gap that exists. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, James. And that was the final remark. I'm closing the queue. Thank you, Daniel, for your presentation. Due to time, we go over to the next presentation and give Gavin the same amount of time as everybody had. So thank you, Daniel, and Gavin, please go ahead.
Thank you, Antoine, and hello, everyone. I'm presenting the EPP TTL extension draft for consideration by the working group. This is a document that has a fairly lengthy life, dating back almost 15 years to when we had a proprietary extension at the CentralNIC system. And I think as a result of a hallway conversation at a previous IETF meeting, I was asked if I could kind of warm it up a little bit and present it for consideration. So if you can move on to the next slide, please. So just to establish what the problem statement is, some TLD operators set long TTL values on their delegations, and I did a little bit of research whilst I was preparing these slides, where there at least one TLD sets a TTL of over 2 weeks on delegations, not necessarily all delegations, but certainly some delegations, and others are of the order of 4 days. But .com, .net, which will represent about half of all the domains that are registered, have a TTL of 2 days. And from what I hear from operators of large second level domains, this is a a deterring factor in them deploying any sort of change to their domain names, especially domain changes that might be considered risky, such as turning DNSSEC on a top 10 domain that you might imagine that one of the big global tech companies might want to secure, but they're terrified of doing so because if they screw it up, there's no rollback. So the intention is to provide a mechanism to allow an EPP client to request a change in a TTL on a delegation through EPP. Next slide, please. This is just some results of the survey. I checked the highest ranking TLD in a Tranco 1 million list for each TLD, and broke the TTL on delegations down by range. So you can see here that there, about 85% of all domains under management have a TTL of at least an hour, which means that if there's an issue with the delegation records, with the DS records, for example, then the operator of that domain is looking at an outage of at least an hour until caches expire. Next slide, please. So what does the EPP extension do? It creates some new extension elements that are added to create, update, and info commands for both domain names and host objects. Very simple syntax. The sex element contains an integer, which is the TTL that should be set on the NS records, DS records, A and quad A records. And you can specify an empty element if you want to reset a previously assigned value to the default. That's included in create and update commands, and then the server can return the current value in the info command response. Because the extension applies to both domain and host objects, you can separately specify a TTL for a domain and also for subordinate host objects. The extension is relatively kind of free form in terms of how server operators can process and implement changes to TTLs according to their own needs, and it makes a normative reference on the change poll extension to ensure that registrars are kept informed of any out of band changes to TTL values. Next slide, please. So here's an example of an update command, which is setting the TTL on example.com to 3600 seconds, relatively straightforward. It's not a particularly complicated extension, and so it's relatively easy to see at first pass what it's designed to do. Next slide, please. So here's an update to a host object. Again, doing the same thing, setting a TTL of 3600 seconds on example.com. Sorry, ns1.example.com. Next slide, please. So I'd like to propose this document for a working group adoption. There are some unresolved issues, and I'm flagging them here for discussion. The first one is the extension interaction with the host attribute model. And Hugo Salgado raised this on the mailing list, and I think it's worth some further thoughts on how and whether the extension needs to be, or the specification needs to be expanded to allow for registries that use the host attribute model to allow clients to specify TTLs on host attributes rather than host objects. This would probably complicate the grammar quite significantly, because you'd need a way to disambiguate between a TTL applying to a domain name and or to host attributes on the same domain name. So therefore there would be need for an attribute or a bit mask of some description just to say this applies to NS and DS but not to A and quad A. Should we therefore need to, as I said before, separate TTLs for separate RR types? Would you want to maintain a long TTL on your NS records because they're stable, and a short TTL on your DS records because you're just deploying DNSSEC or you're about to go through a rollover. And is there benefit in allowing that? Is the added complexity justified by the benefits? And also, I would like to ask people to consider implementing this extension and providing feedback, because obviously implementation is helpful in terms of defining what the challenges and problems are and getting us down the track towards publication as an RFC. So that's the last slide is just a points of contact if anyone has any comments or feedback. Obviously the regex mailing list is probably the best place.
Unfortunately,
Yeah.
Gavin. So if, I don't know if you still want to answer some questions.
Happy to answer questions.
So Jim was out of the queue. You sure if you can make it very short because we still have another remark to make? Or Jim was actually first, so Jim.
Yep. Thanks very much, Antoine. Very quick. I think this is a great idea, Gavin. I would like to see it adopted by the working group. The idea of having separate values for the TTLs for the different resource record types is probably necessary, but I think this could create corner cases where we might have things like something expiring from a cache, like a DS record going out while the NS records are still valid. So we may need to have some mechanism for recommending that the TTLs should be the same, but there maybe they need to change these. Thanks.
Yashiro, quick, please.
Yes. Yashiro Yonea from JPRS. Is this extension willing to change eternally or temporarily? I think this kind of changes for the temporary.
So intention is to not specify timeframes for TTL changes. That could be down to the server to decide. And if a server decides that TTL changes are only allowed to be temporary, then it can use the change poll extension to tell the registrar when they've reset the TTL value.
Okay, and Richard, we have 10 seconds left.
10 seconds, I'll be quick. So Gavin, I can just put this in mailing list. I'm not a big fan of having it be a should on the change poll notification, because in my experience, a lot of registrars ignore those and jam those up. I'll put that to the list. Thanks.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Gavin. And yeah, let's put the rest to the list. Also to Daniel, I want to say, if you have your document adopted, please send the message to the chairs, and we will guide you in the process. But feedback on the list is always welcome. Then we move to any other business, and we already have an issue there or something. Let's. Oh.
Yeah, go ahead, Ed. You're at the
go ahead.
I just want to plug something that's actually on the mailing list. The Registry Operations Workshop will be held this year, remote event, June 20th. The details are in the message. I won't go through that. The call for papers is open as of like today or yesterday, give or take the day. And we'll take until May 19th, I believe, is the window for submitting something. So we're looking for input for that. And the rest of it should be in that email. If not, you can try to find me and ask me for questions. That's all I wanted to say.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Lewis. And with that, we reached the end of the agenda, and apologies for, being short in time this time. We have to schedule perhaps a little bit longer next time. I want to thank everybody for participating. Let's continue the discussions on the list. And if there are any other business, then this meeting is adjourned. And thank you to Rick Wilhelm for putting most of the scribes in the notepad. And with that, thank you all.
Thanks, Antoine. See ya.
Yeah, we'll be in touch.